The lawyer for the Republican legislators, one David Thompson, argued to the Supreme Court that the Elections Clause gives all of the authority to a state's legislature and to make rules for federal elections. State courts, therefore, cannot restrict a legislature's broad discretion to enact what rules they see fit. Rather, they are limited to enforcing procedural limits on the legislature's authority.
I mean, I don't feel like that's the intent of the law there. And I don't know necessarily that the Supreme Court justices do either. This has run into some pretty skeptical responses from the various justices on the court. Justice Elena Kagan, in her questioning, listed a slew of previous SCOTUS cases that made it clear that state courts can constrain the legislature's power over federal elections as long as they're applying a state's constitution, which makes sense to me, given that a state's constitution is what grants power to respective government bodies within that state. It's really hard to argue, hey, the court can't do this when your own state's constitution specifically says the courts can do this thing. Or, more realistically, the Constitution doesn't explicitly give the legislature power to do something, and the court simply points out that you can't do that. So basically, Justice Kagan pointed out that SCOTUS has said that the Supreme Court can say, there's a lot of says in that particular moment right there.
Yep.
Oh,
Kagan says that previous Supreme Courts have said that state Supreme Courts can say,
yes, you can't do that because the Constitution doesn't give you permission to do that. Or you can't do that because the Constitution explicitly says you can't do that and still be within the bounds of their powers. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson also voiced concerns in a similar vein, discussing that the state constitution creates the state legislature, and therefore the constraints contained in the Constitution apply to that legislature, including that legislature's power under the Elections Clause.
Again, this document is what gives you your authority. Obey it. This is pretty simple. Chief Justice John Roberts also seemed skeptical about Thompson's interpretation of the Elections Clause and the broad power it would afford to state legislatures. To support his point that state legislatures have never been really allowed unchecked power, he pointed to a 1932 Supreme Court case, Smiley v. Holm.
Taking it way back.
Yeah, in which the justices upheld Minnesota Governor Floyd B. Olson's veto of a congressional map enacted by the state legislature. Sounds familiar. The more things change, the more they stay the same, really. Smiley, Roberts said, is a pretty significant exception to this interpretation that undermines the legislature's argument that it can do whatever it wants. We would like to point out here that those were Justice Roberts' actual words, not our paraphrasing. Quote, undermines the legislature's argument that it can do whatever it wants. I don't know exactly the emphasis he put on it when he said that, but in my head, it was incredibly dry sarcasm.
Hopefully somewhere there's a clip out there that exists of that, and I'm going to go find it.
Yeah.
Because it cannot possibly have been anything other than sarcastic.
Yeah.
Justice Neil Gorsuch has tried to spin a little bit more nuance into his interpretation, stating that state legislatures have not all thought themselves limited by their state constitution on election issues. He pointed to the Civil War. There was an interesting problem in the Civil War. State constitutions would have prevented soldiers stationed away from their homes from participating as absentee voters. However, state legislatures didn't adhere to these limitations. Justice Gorsuch also seemed to suggest that limitations such as those imposed in Smiley v. Holm are different from those imposed by state courts because the veto can be regarded as sharing legislative power. Throwback here, you'll remember from your high school civics class that power in the US government is divided between three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch executes those laws or carries them out, and the judicial branch evaluates and applies those laws when questions arise. Justice Gorsuch's argument is essentially that the executive branch, when exercising its veto, has a limited role in creating legislation as well. Therefore, it is within the bounds of the Elections Clause, which limits creating laws about federal elections to the state legislature, for a member of the executive branch to use its legislative power to influence the creation of these laws. In other words, the legislature is not just the state legislature as we think about it. It's not just the state House of Representatives and the state Senate.
Yes. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, she brought a different argument to Thompson. She was kind of asking, how in the world do you draw a line between these claimed substantive limits on the legislature's discretion, which Thompson had argued the courts didn't have the power to do, and procedural limits, which Thompson had argued was the only power that the state could enforce. Just the attempt, she said, would be a logical morass, which really is an enjoyable turn of phrase. I liked it.
It really is.
How do you end up concluding that a certain limitation was a substantive limit and not a procedural one? Let's take another quick trip to civics class really quick. Obviously, it's a quick trip. When you hear the word substantive in legal context, in a legal context, they're talking about the actual rights and obligations that govern people and organizations. Procedural, on the other hand, refers to the rules that govern how substantive law is created, applied, and enforced. Substantive law creates the right in question. Procedural law guides how we adjudicate the exercise or restriction of that substantive law.
Yeah.
Clear as
in
mud.
essence, clear as mud. It is a logical morass. In essence, Thompson was arguing that state courts couldn't limit substantive legislation, only legislation, oh my God, only legislation that discussed how you applied substantive legislation. But we're talking about voting here. Voting is both a right and a process. You have the right to vote, and this is how you vote. Any limitation that a court placed on legislation about voting could be argued to be both a substantive and a procedural limit. If you, the court, say I, the citizen, can vote unless it's Sunday, you are limiting the procedure of how I vote, saying Sundays are off limits. But you're also limiting my substantive right by saying I can't actually exercise that right on a specific day.
Justice Amy Coney Barrett summarized how intertwined these principles are, which is very, by saying the distinction between the two limits are notoriously difficult lines to draw, which I think is a beautiful understatement. Justice Samuel Alito seems to agree with Thompson, however, which Alito is, on the more conservative end of things. And by more, I mean extremely. And so he agrees with Thompson, who's representing a conservative body here. And he said that he resisted any suggestion that ruling in favor of an independent state legislature would actually threaten democracy. His argument is that many state Supreme Courts are elected. Justices have to run for their office, they have to campaign, they have to fundraise and go through the standard electoral rigmarole. Given this, he asked whether it really advances democracy to transfer the, quote, political controversy about redistricting from the legislature to elected Supreme Courts, where the candidates are permitted by state law to campaign on the issue of redistricting. In other words, is it really better for democracy to reject the Independent State Legislature Theory, which would keep ultimate authority within a considerably larger and therefore more representative elected body, in favor of allowing the matter to be handled by a much smaller elected body that can explicitly campaign on their plans to support or oppose gerrymandering? It's a good question. I gotta say.
Actually, that's a fair question.
It's a pretty fair question.
I
I think it ignores the reality of the fact that gerrymander districts are already a thing, and therefore state legislatures aren't necessarily representative of state populations.
Yeah.
But there's a point in there.
Well, and it also ignores the fact that on your average ballot, the judges are the least researched and the most likely to be either ignored, as in like we just don't fill in the bubble, or people are just likely to fill in whatever bubble they think. So campaigning as a judge is likely to have much smaller impact than the actual state legislature and those candidates have. So, I mean, I don't know. It's a fair question.
I actually do agree. It is a pretty fair question.
I'm not usually in favor of giving Alito, credit for good ideas, but
I know. I felt dirty, but I mean, he's got a point. Like,
he does.
The ultimate point of democracy is to represent the will of the people. The best way to represent the will of the people is to have a representative sample of the people. The more representative sample is going to be the larger elected body.
Yeah, it really is.